So this is going back to 2015. It's been quite some time, quite the journey. And in 2015, I had left Twitter to join Lyft. And just even going back a bit further in history, prior to Lyft, I was at Twitter for 3 years, where I worked on Twitter's Edge proxy system. So at Twitter, I got quite a bit of exposure to how people, were building large microservice architectures, and I was exposed to a lot of the intricacies of API development and edge serving and observability and fault tolerance. And when I left Twitter and I joined Lyft in 2015, I was really hired, not to build Envoy. I was hired to help Lyft actually scale its burgeoning microservice architecture. So at the time, like most companies, Lyft had a monolithic architecture, a large PHP application, and had started down the microservice journey for all the same reasons that most organizations do. They had 60 or 70 different developers, and people were starting to stomp on each other as they were trying to develop within this monolithic application. So when I joined, Lyft had the monolithic application, and it also had, I can't remember now, but probably something on the order of 20 or 30 different microservices. And Lyft was starting to experience a lot of the pain that folks feel when they adopt microservice architectures, because, like it or not, microservice architectures are really, an order of magnitude more complicated than monolithic architectures. Folks have to deal with observability problems, networking problems. There's just a lot of scalability issues that don't occur when one is using a simpler architecture. And additionally, most modern organizations like Lyft these days, within the last decade, they're what I would call polyglot organizations. And by that, I mean that they're implementing things in multiple different languages. So the days, for example, of an organization choosing Java and everything being implemented in Java are largely over. Now we see organizations building their applications in a combination of PHP and Go and Java and Rust, and there's just all types of languages. So the way that organizations like Twitter had typically solved these problems, being a JVM-based organization, is by developing a sophisticated library that everyone would link into their application that would handle common concerns, things like load balancing and service discovery and observability. So when I came to Lyft and I saw, that Lyft, again, was having a lot of the problems that people have, just generally a lack of observability around external edge calls, a lack of observability around service-to-service calls, really a situation where developers at Lyft did not trust the microservice architecture. They were almost on the verge of aborting that microservice architecture rollout and moving back to their monolithic architecture. So I came and I looked at this problem holistically. And given my experience at Twitter, I said, well, what if we built a new proxy that could handle a lot of this logic, and we could do it out of process? So instead of being a library that's linked into every application and having to then, implement the same logic in 5 or 6 different languages, what if we actually developed this sophisticated logic once, and we could abstract away a bunch of this functionality so that it would be usable from every language? And actually, Envoy was first launched at Lyft as an edge proxy. So we used it for our edge traffic just because it was a bit simpler to actually deploy it there first. And we saw a lot of observability gains from doing that. And then very quickly, we deployed Envoy next to our monolith and used it for incoming calls, helping to load balance and rate limit out to MongoDB. So very quickly, we actually had a little mini service mesh where we had Envoy at the edge and Envoy next to our monolithic application. And then the rest is really history, where we pretty rapidly deployed Envoy as a sidecar next to every service at Lyft. And then within about 6 or 9 months, Lyft's architecture was wholly reliant on using Envoy as both an edge proxy and as what we would call now a service mesh proxy. Obviously, this is before that many people were talking about service meshes. And by any measure, Envoy has been very successful at Lyft. It has allowed Lyft to, for better or worse, scale to thousands of services and over 1,000 developers. And most developers at Lyft don't need to understand most of the intricacies of the underlying networking system, and they can focus on their business logic. And that's really the goal at the end of the day, is that from the infrastructure standpoint, we want application developers to focus on their business logic. We don't want them to focus on plumbing. And the state of the cloud native ecosystem right now is that it's still a little bit rough. And I think a lot of the tooling that we're working on these days is, again, to make it so that folks can focus on their business logic. So that's how Envoy got started at Lyft.